At 2:17 a.m. on November 9, 1950, Corporal James "Jimmy" Dalton lay prone in a shallow drainage ditch along the Chongchon River Valley in North Korea, watching 47 Chinese People's Volunteer Army soldiers maneuver their convoy of 3 Type 94 trucks through the frozen mud 380 yards to his northeast. He had exactly 23 feet of braided steel wire, 2 wooden stakes, and a combat knife. The nearest friendly position was a destroyed farmhouse 600 yards behind him, where the remnants of Baker Company's 2nd Platoon had retreated after losing half their strength to a surprise night assault. In the next 4 minutes, he would use a technique so ancient that Roman legionnaires would have recognized it, so simple that a child could understand it, and so devastatingly effective that 3 vehicles weighing over 5 tons each would cartwheel through the air, like toys thrown by an angry god, proving that the deadliest innovations in war don't come from engineers, but from desperate men who refuse to die. The wire sang in the darkness. That's what the survivors would remember most. Not the explosions, not the screaming, not even the sight of a fully loaded military truck flipping end over end in a spray of dirt and fire. They would remember that sound, a high, keening whistle like a banshee's wail, as 3 tons of steel-reinforced cable went taut at 40 miles per hour. Some said it sounded like a violin string snapping. Others swore it was the shriek of something unholy, something that had no place on a modern battlefield, dominated by artillery, air support, and automatic weapons. But Jimmy Dalton knew exactly what it was. It was the sound of history repeating itself. The sound of a weapon so old that military historians had classified it as obsolete in 1917. A weapon that had been banned by 3 separate international conventions, not because it was inhumane, but because it was too effective, too unpredictable, too prone to causing catastrophic mechanical failures that could wipe out entire motorized columns. A weapon that existed in the gray zone between trap and ambush, between defensive fortification and offensive strike capability. A weapon that every officer in the United States Army had been explicitly ordered never to deploy. And yet, on that frozen November morning, with the Chinese pushing south in overwhelming numbers, with Baker Company scattered and bleeding, with friendly lines collapsing across the entire Korean peninsula, Corporal James Dalton would resurrect a technique that Napoleon's cavalry had learned to fear, that the German Wehrmacht had tried to perfect and ultimately abandoned, that existed in classified military manuals only as a cautionary tale about the dangers of improvised field engineering. He would take 23 feet of wire and turn it into a guillotine for machines. The story of what happened that night would spread through the ranks like wildfire. It would be told in mess halls and foxholes, embellished and exaggerated until the truth became indistinguishable from legend. Some versions claimed he used barbed wire stolen from a Japanese prison camp. Others insisted it was aircraft cable salvaged from a downed B-29. A few swore he had somehow acquired a genuine Roman tripcord, preserved for 2,000 years and waiting for this exact moment. The truth, as always, was somehow both more mundane and more remarkable. But before we can understand the night Jimmy Dalton achieved the impossible, we need to understand the man himself, and why, until that frozen morning, nobody believed he would survive his first month of combat. James Michael Dalton was born on April 3, 1929, in the hill country outside Elko, Nevada, where the sagebrush grew thick, and the nearest neighbor lived 11 miles down a dirt road that turned to soup every spring. His father, Marcus Dalton raised sheep, 300 head of stubborn, dim-witted animals that seemed to possess a supernatural ability to find new and creative ways to die, drowning in irrigation ditches, tangling themselves in fencing, wandering into coyote territory, despite every precaution. Young Jimmy's job, starting from age 7, was to keep them alive. "The boy's simple," his Uncle Robert would say, not unkindly, watching Jimmy spend hours repositioning fence lines, adjusting the tension on wire barriers, testing and retesting the primitive snares and barriers he'd constructed to funnel the sheep away from danger. Smart enough, but simple. Thinks about one thing at a time. Same thing over and over. It was true. While other children in the one-room schoolhouse solved arithmetic problems or memorized state capitals, Jimmy thought about tension and angles, about how much force a fence post could withstand, about the way a predator moved through space, following the path of least resistance, about the precise point where a wire barrier became a trap. His teacher, Mrs. Henrietta Walsh, a veteran of 30 years of rural education, recognized something the others missed. "He's not simple," she told Marcus Dalton one afternoon, watching Jimmy through the window as he carefully adjusted the height of a chicken wire barrier. "He's a spatial thinker. Sees the world in 3 dimensions. Most people think in lines. He thinks in volumes, in zones, in fields of force." "That gonna help him graduate?" Marcus asked. "Probably not," she admitted. "But it might keep him alive." She had no idea how right she was. Jimmy graduated high school in 1947, 16th in a class of 19, with no prospects and no ambitions beyond taking over his father's sheep operation. He knew every inch of the family's 840 acres. He knew where flash floods would channel, where snowdrifts would pile, where coyotes would probe for weakness. And he knew, with a precision that bordered on supernatural, exactly how to position wire barriers to control movement across terrain. "It's all about the angles," he would explain to anyone who would listen, which was almost nobody. "See? A fence is stupid. Just sits there. But wire at the right height, right tension, strung across the right approach vector, that's not a fence. That's a weapon. That's a blade, waiting for something to run into it." His father would nod absently, not really understanding. His mother would smile and serve him another helping of potatoes. His younger sister Margaret would roll her eyes and whisper to her friends that Jimmy was touched in the head. But the sheep stayed alive. Year after year, while neighboring ranches lost dozens of animals to predators, accidents, and bad luck, the Dalton flock remained intact. Jimmy's wire barriers channeled them away from danger, with an efficiency that seemed almost magical. Coyotes that approached the grazing areas would find themselves funneled into dead-end gullies, caught in carefully positioned snares, or simply turned away by barriers that seemed to anticipate every possible approach. "Boy's got a gift," said Martin Chen, whose ranch bordered the Daltons' property to the east. "Ain't a normal gift, ain't useful for much, but it's a gift." That gift remained untested until October 1949, when Chinese Communist forces crossed the Yalu River and the Korean War suddenly became inevitable. Jimmy was 20 years old, unmarried, and eligible for the draft. When his notice arrived in March 1950, he reported to Fort Ord, California, for basic training with the quiet resignation of a man who'd always known his careful, methodical life was too good to last. The U.S. Army in 1950 was an institution built on speed, firepower, and overwhelming technological superiority. Fresh from victory in World War II, confident in its doctrine and equipment, it had little patience for soldiers who thought differently than the manual prescribed. Jimmy Dalton thought very differently. "Dalton," Drill Sergeant Marcus Webb Spurs could strip paint off a Jeep. "What the hell are you doing?" It was week 3 of basic training, and the recruits of Charlie Company were learning to set up defensive positions. The exercise was simple. Dig a foul, establish fields of fire, position your squad to maximize interlocking coverage. Standard infantry doctrine. Taught the same way it had been taught since 1918. Jimmy had dug his foxhole exactly as instructed. Then he'd spent 40 minutes doing something else, stringing tripwires in an elaborate geometric pattern that extended 15 yards in front of his position. "Dalton, I asked you a question, Private." "Setting up defenses, Drill Sergeant." Jimmy didn't look up, his hands still working, adjusting the tension on a wire strung between 2 stakes. "Those are tripwires, son. We covered those on day 1. You set 1, maybe 2, as early warning. You don't set up a goddamn spider web. You're not catching flies. You're stopping enemy infantry." "Yes, Drill Sergeant. These aren't for stopping. They're for channeling." Webb stared at him. "Channeling?" "Yes, Drill Sergeant. See, if you position the wires at different heights and angles, you create what I call a movement corridor. Enemy soldiers will naturally avoid the wires they can see, which pushes them into the approach vector where my field of fire is strongest. The ones who don't see the wires," Jimmy demonstrated with his hand, showing how a running soldier would catch ankle-height wire, "they go down, which creates an obstacle for the ones behind them, which causes a backup in the approach, which gives me more time to—" "Shut up." Webb's face had gone dangerously red. "You think you're smarter than the U.S. Army Infantry Manual, Dalton?" "No, Drill Sergeant." "You think you invented something new? Something that professional soldiers with 20 years of experience haven't thought of?" "No, Drill Sergeant." "Then take that hillbilly rat trap bullshit down and set up your position the right way. 5 minutes. Move." Jimmy complied without argument, but the damage was done. Word spread through Charlie Company. The weird shepherd from Nevada was trying to reinvent warfare with chicken wire and wooden stakes. The mockery was relentless, but not particularly malicious. Most of it came from genuine confusion. "Hey, Dalton, you gonna catch us some rabbits with those snares?" "Dalton's setting up a coyote trap, boys. Watch out. Maybe he thinks the North Koreans travel in flocks. Gonna herd 'em like sheep." Jimmy took it all with the same quiet patience he'd shown when his sister called him simple. He didn't argue, didn't defend himself. He simply continued thinking about angles and tension, about movement patterns and approach vectors, about the way an enemy force would flow across terrain, like water flowing downhill, following the path of least resistance. There was one exception to the general mockery. Sergeant First Class Raymond Ray Kowalski, a World War II veteran who'd fought in the hedgerows of Normandy and the frozen forests of the Ardennes. Kowalski was 34 years old enough to have seen things that the younger instructors hadn't, and he watched Jimmy's efforts with an expression that was hard to read. One evening, after the rest of the platoon had headed to the mess hall, Kowalski approached Jimmy's bunk. "Dalton, Sergeant, that wire work you were doing, where'd you learn it?" "Sheep ranch, Sergeant, keeping predators away from the flock." Kowalski nodded slowly. "You know what caltrops are, son?" "Yes, Sergeant." "Spiked metal devices, ancient weapon. Meant to stop cavalry or slow infantry advance? Right. You know what the Germans used in the Ardennes? When they were trying to slow our armor advance? Jimmy shook his head. Logs. That's it. Big goddamn logs dragged across roads, positioned at curves where our tank drivers couldn't see them until it was too late. Hit one of those at 20 miles per hour, throws the whole track assembly. Tanks dead. 3 logs, strategically placed, stopped an entire armored column for 8 hours. Cost us maybe $100 in lumber. Cost them nothing. They used trees from the forest. But it was more effective than their 88mm guns because it was unexpected. Simple. And it worked. Kowalski sat down on the edge of the footlocker. Here's what nobody teaches in basic training, Dalton. Every army in history, I mean every single one, has forgotten the same lesson. They get so focused on the new technology, the new weapons, the new doctrine, that they forget the old shit still works. Wire barriers stopped cavalry charges for 2,000 years. You think they stop working just because we invented the machine gun? No, Sergeant. But here's the problem. Kowalski's voice dropped lower. Nobody wants to hear it. Not from a corporal, and sure as hell not from a private. You start talking about ancient weapons, improvised barriers, low-tech solutions. Officers think you're criticizing their training. NCOs think you're undermining discipline. Other enlisted think you're weird. I've noticed, Sergeant. So here's my advice. And I'm only saying this once. Shut the hell up about your wire tricks until you're in actual combat. Hear the standard doctrine. Memorize it. Regurgitate it on command. But when the shit hits the fan, and it will hit the fan, son, because we're going to Korea, and Korea is going to be a bloodbath, that's when you use what you know, not before. Understood? Yes, Sergeant. Understood. Good. Kowalski stood up. One more thing. You ever hear about the Battle of Carrhae? No, Sergeant. Romans versus Parthians. 53 BC, Romans had the best infantry in the world. Disciplined, well-trained, equipped with superior armor and weapons. Parthians were basically horse archers, with a bunch of improvised tactics that didn't fit the Roman playbook. Romans thought it would be a massacre. Their massacre. What happened? 20,000 Roman legionnaires died. Parthians used terrain, mobility, and unconventional tactics. Pulled the Romans into a killing ground where their training and equipment didn't matter. It was Rome's worst defeat in 100 years. Kowalski headed toward the door, then paused. History's full of battles where the side with worse equipment won because they understood something simple. War isn't about having the best toys. It's about using what you have in ways the enemy doesn't expect. Remember that. Jimmy never forgot. But the rest of Charlie Company did. To them, Dalton remained the weird sheep farmer who thought too much about wire and not enough about shooting straight. When they shipped out for Korea in August 1950, he was broadly considered the least likely member of Baker Company to distinguish himself in combat. They were very, very wrong. November 1950, the United Nations forces, led by General Douglas MacArthur, had pushed deep into North Korea, racing toward the Chinese border with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. The North Korean People's Army was in full retreat. Victory seemed days away. American troops were joking about being home by Christmas. Then the Chinese attacked. Not in the carefully organized formations that American intelligence expected. Not with the limited numbers that reconnaissance suggested. They came in human waves. Hundreds of thousands of People's Volunteer Army soldiers pouring across the Yalu River in what would become one of the largest surprise attacks in military history. Baker Company, 2nd Battalion, 23rd Infantry Regiment, was positioned along the Chongchon River Valley when the offensive began. They'd been told to expect light resistance and scattered enemy units. Instead, they got hell. The first wave hit at 10:30 p.m. on November 7th. Chinese forces, moving under cover of darkness, infiltrated through UN lines with an efficiency that shocked American commanders. They used bugles and whistles to coordinate attacks, creating a cacophony of sound that was both terrifying and tactically brilliant. Impossible to pinpoint specific unit locations through the noise. Baker Company's defensive position was a low ridge overlooking a small village and the frozen river valley beyond. Standard defensive deployment, foxholes every 15 yards, interlocking fields of fire, 230 caliber machine gun positions anchoring the flanks. By the book infantry doctrine. It lasted 17 minutes. The Chinese didn't charge the ridge. They flowed around it like water, infiltrating through gaps in the line that American officers insisted didn't exist. Within 20 minutes, Baker Company's flanks were collapsing. Within 40, they were surrounded. By midnight, they were fighting for survival. Corporal Jimmy Dalton spent that first night crouched in his foxhole, firing his M1 Garand until the barrel glowed red, watching men he'd trained with die in ways the manual never mentioned. The Chinese didn't mass in convenient target-rich formations. They moved in small groups, using terrain features, appearing and disappearing like ghosts. They were outnumbered in terms of firepower, but they were winning because they understood something the Americans didn't. Mobility beats firepower when you control the terrain. By dawn, on November 8th, Baker Company had retreated 3 miles. They'd lost 37 men killed, 53 wounded. The survivors were exhausted, low on ammunition, and psychologically shattered. "We need to fall back to the main line," Lieutenant Marcus Chen said, studying a map by flashlight in the ruined farmhouse that served as their temporary command post. "Pull back to where we can get artillery support. Air cover." "Sir?" That was Sergeant Kowalski, looking 10 years older than he had a week ago. "The Chinese are moving faster than we are. Every time we pull back, they're already in position behind us. We need to slow them down." "How?" "We barely have enough ammo for basic defense. Roadblocks, obstacles. Make them work for every mile." Chen shook his head. "We don't have mines, don't have explosives, don't have time to build proper fortifications." That's when Jimmy Dalton spoke up. "Sir, permission to speak." Every head turned. Jimmy Dalton had barely said 10 words since landing in Korea. He was known as a decent shot, a reliable foxhole mate, and absolutely nothing else. "Go ahead, Dalton. There's a supply dump 2 miles west. Engineers abandoned it when they pulled back yesterday. I saw it on the way here. Cable spools, wire, steel stakes. If we could get there, I could set up obstacles across the approach roads, slow down their vehicles, maybe even stop them." "Wire barriers?" Lieutenant Chen's voice was incredulous. "Dalton, we're fighting a modern army with trucks, artillery, and automatic weapons. You want to stop them with a fence wire?"
Not fence wire, sir. Cable. Aircraft cable if we can get it. Heavy gauge stuff. Strung at the right height, across the right choke points. It'll do nothing. That was Staff Sergeant Mills, the platoon's senior NCO, and his voice carried the weight of 15 years of service.
Wire barriers are for crowd control and perimeter security. You string wire across a road, a truck just snaps it and keeps going. Physics, Dalton. 5 tons of truck versus 50 pounds of wire. Wire loses every time. Not if it's positioned right. There is no right position for wire against vehicles. Trust me, son. I've seen tank traps, dragon's teeth, concrete barriers, things that actually work. Wire isn't one of them. Jimmy wanted to argue, wanted to explain the mathematics of it, the geometry, the way that force multiplied through leverage could turn something weak into something devastating. But he remembered Kowalski's advice. Shut up until you're in combat. They were in combat now, but nobody was listening. Dalton, Kowalski's voice cut through the discussion. You really think you can stop vehicles with wire? Yes. Sergeant, not stop permanently, but flip them, disable them, create obstacles that are harder to clear than the wire itself. Flip them. Mills laughed, but it was a tired, bitter sound. Kid thinks he's going to flip a 5-ton truck with wire. What did they put in the water back in Nevada? Sir? Kowalski ignored Mills and focused on Lieutenant Chen. We've got nothing else. Let him try. Worst case, we waste some wire and a few hours. Best case, we slow down their advance long enough to get organized. Chen studied Jimmy for a long moment. The young corporal looked back steadily, neither defiant nor desperate, just quietly certain. Fine. Take 3 men. Get to that supply dump. But Dalton, if this doesn't work, if you waste our time and resources on some ranch hand fantasy, you're going on point for the next week. Understood? Yes, sir. And Dalton, you've got 4 hours. If you're not back by 0400, we're pulling out without you. Jimmy nodded. He selected his team carefully. Private Luis Hernandez, who'd worked construction before the war and understood tools. Private First Class David Fletcher, who was strong enough to carry heavy loads without complaint, and Corporal Michael Torres, who had a knack for navigating terrain in darkness. They left the farmhouse at 11:45 p.m., moving through frozen rice paddies under a moonless sky, with Chinese forces somewhere in the darkness around them, and 4 hours to achieve something that everyone except Sergeant Kowalski thought was impossible. The abandoned engineer supply dump sat in a shallow valley 3 miles west of Baker Company's position, far enough from the front line that the engineers had left it intact when they pulled back, close enough that Chinese advance elements would reach it by dawn. Jimmy and his team approached cautiously, watching for sentries or patrols, but found nothing. The Chinese were advancing so fast they hadn't had time to secure their flanks. The dump was exactly what Jimmy had hoped for. Cable spools, steel stakes, tools, and equipment abandoned in the chaos of retreat. But there was a problem. Jesus Christ! Hernandez stood staring at the cable spools. This is aircraft arresting cable. The heavy stuff they use on carriers to catch landing planes. You can't work with this, Dalton. Each strand is thick as your thumb. You'd need industrial cutting tools. Jimmy was already examining the spools, his hands running over the braided steel. How much tension can this hold? I don't know. Thousands of pounds? It's designed to stop a fighter jet landing at 150 miles per hour. Perfect. Perfect. Dalton, we can't cut it. We can't work it. It's too heavy to string across a road. This stuff is designed for industrial use with specialized equipment. But Jimmy was already thinking 3 moves ahead, seeing the problem not as a barrier, but as an opportunity. The cable was indeed too thick to cut with standard tools, but that didn't matter. He didn't need to cut it. He needed to position it. Fletch, help me get one of these spools onto that truck. He pointed to an abandoned deuce-and-a-half parked at the edge of the dump. We're stealing a truck now? We're commandeering it. Big difference. It took all 4 of them to maneuver a cable spool, 6 feet in diameter, weighing nearly 400 pounds, onto the truck bed. Jimmy climbed up beside it, studying the terrain, the roads, the approach vectors that Chinese vehicles would have to use. Torres map. Show me the main SIPI route they'll use to bring up reinforcements. Torres spread a map across the truck's hood, using a red-filtered flashlight to illuminate it. Main road runs north-south through here. It's the only route that can handle heavy vehicles. Everything else is footpaths and frozen rice paddies. Choke points. 2, here and here. Torres indicated spots on the map where the road narrowed, passing between ridgelines or through villages. But Dalton, even if you block those points, they'll just go around. Not if I do it right. Jimmy's finger traced the terrain features. This choke point, the one near the burned-out village. The road curves there, yeah? Sharp curve. Maybe 30-degree angle. And on either side? Steep embankment on the left, drainage ditch on the right. Why? Jimmy smiled for the first time since landing in Korea. Because that's not a choke point. That's a killing ground. Load up everything you can carry. We've got work to do. They took 3 spools of arresting cable, a dozen steel stakes, 2 sledgehammers, bolt cutters, and, Jimmy insisted on this, a coil of standard tripwire. Hernandez wanted to question the logic of bringing lightweight wire when they had heavy gauge cable, but something in Dalton's expression stopped him. The convoy drove east with headlights off, navigating by moonlight and familiarity with terrain, reaching the choke point at 1:30 a.m. They had less than 3 hours until Lieutenant Chen's deadline, and probably less than 5 hours until Chinese vehicles started using this road. Okay, Dalton. Hernandez jumped down from the truck. We're here. Now what? Jimmy stood in the middle of the road, turning slowly, his eyes tracking sight lines that nobody else could see. To the other 3 men, he looked like he was praying or possibly losing his mind. But Jimmy was doing something else entirely. He was mapping the invisible architecture of force and motion that would turn a simple length of wire into a weapon of catastrophic effectiveness. Fletch, take these stakes. I need one positioned here. Jimmy walked 30 yards up the road to a spot where the curve began, driven down to bedrock. This has to hold against multiple tons of lateral force. Dalton, there's no bedrock here. It's all frozen mud. Then drive it deep, 6 feet if you can. While Fletch worked the sledgehammer, Jimmy positioned the others. Torres on the opposite side of the road, driving stakes into the embankment. Hernandez working the cable spool, unspooling heavy-gauge steel wire under Jimmy's precise direction. Height is critical, Jimmy said, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of a man who'd spent his entire life thinking about this exact problem. Too low, the truck drives over it. Too high, it catches on the cab instead of the axle. We needed exactly 2 feet, 3 inches off the ground. That's oddly specific, Torres grunted, straining against a stake that didn't want it to go deeper. It's the height of the front axle on a Type 94 truck. I measured one back at the last checkpoint we passed. You measured... Hernandez stopped working. When? While we were being evacuated. Figured I might need to know. The three men exchanged glances. Dalton was either brilliant or insane, and at 1:45 a.m. in frozen North Korea, it was hard to tell the difference. The work was brutal. Driving stakes into frozen ground required strength and precision. Unspooling and positioning cable that weighed 40 pounds per linear foot required all four of them working in coordination. And doing it all in near total darkness, with the constant fear that Chinese patrols might appear at any moment, added a layer of psychological pressure that made every minute feel like an hour. But slowly, methodically, Jimmy's vision took shape. The primary cable, the killing wire, stretched across the road at exactly 2 feet, 3 inches, anchored to stakes driven deep enough to withstand several tons of lateral force. But that was only the beginning. Jimmy positioned secondary wires at different heights and angles, creating what he called a reaction cascade. Lower tripwires designed to be seen and avoided, forcing vehicles to slow and adjust their path. Higher wires that would catch on cargo or personnel if the trucks were loaded with troops. It's like a funnel, Jimmy explained, working with his hands to demonstrate. The visible obstacles push them toward the center of the road, right into the primary wire. They won't see it until they're committed to the turn, and by then, it's too late. And if they see the primary wire, Hernandez asked,
then they stop and try to cut it, which buys us time. But they won't see it. Not in the dark, not at speed, not until the front axle catches it. At 2:45 a.m., with 15 minutes left before Lieutenant Chen's deadline, Jimmy made his final adjustments. He tested the tension on the primary cable by having all four men pull on it simultaneously. The steel stakes groaned, but held. The cable itself hummed with potential energy, stretched taut across the road, like a bowstring waiting for release. Torres, mark this position on your map. Note the exact location of the cable. I want artillery observers to know what's here, so they don't accidentally hit our wire. You really think this is going to work? Torres asked. Jimmy looked at the road, at the careful geometry of wire and stakes,
at the invisible kill zone he'd created through nothing more than physics, patience, and a lifetime of thinking about how predators move through space. Yeah, he said quietly. I really do. They made it back to the farmhouse at 3:58 a.m., 2 minutes before Lieutenant Chen's deadline. Most of Baker Company was asleep, grabbing rest while they could. Kowalski was awake, standing watch, and he nodded approval when Jimmy reported that the obstacles were in place. Now we wait, Kowalski said. Now we wait, Jimmy agreed. Neither of them slept. They sat in the darkness, watching the road to the east, waiting for dawn and whatever it would bring. At 6:15 a.m., as gray light began to seep across the frozen landscape, a runner arrived with news. Chinese forces were moving south in strength. Estimates suggested 3 divisions, possibly more, with mechanized support and artillery. Baker Company's position was no longer viable. Lieutenant Chen ordered immediate evacuation. What about the wire obstacles? Someone asked. Leave them. We don't have time. Move out in 10 minutes. Light packs only. Wounded get vehicle priority. The company was in motion when Jimmy made his decision. Instead of following the evacuation column west, he grabbed his rifle and headed east, toward the position where he'd strung the cable. "Dalton!" Kowalski's voice cracked like a whip. "Where the hell are you going?" "I need to see if it works, Sergeant. That's a goddamn suicide mission. The Chinese are using that road right now." "I know. That's why I need to see it." Kowalski stared at him for 3 seconds that felt like 3 years. Then, incredibly, he grabbed his own rifle and followed. "You're the dumbest smart person I have ever met, Dalton. You know that?" "Yes, Sergeant." They moved fast, using terrain features and morning mist for concealment, reaching an observation position on a low ridge overlooking the kill zone at 6:47 a.m. Below them, the road was empty. The wire was invisible in the half-light, exactly as Jimmy had designed it. "How long do you figure before—" Kowalski began. That's when they heard it. The low growl of diesel engines, growing louder. Chinese convoy. 3 Type 94 trucks, heavily loaded, moving at Maradona speed along the supply route. They were perhaps half a mile away, approaching the curve where Jimmy had positioned his wire. "Jesus Christ," Kowalski whispered. "They're actually coming." Jimmy's hands were steady as he raised his binoculars, but his heart was hammering against his ribs. This was it. Either his calculations were correct, and everything he'd ever believed about force, tension, and geometry would be vindicated, or he'd wasted critical resources and time on a sheep farmer's delusion. The lead truck entered the curve. From their observation post, Jimmy and Kowalski had a perfect view. They watched the truck's headlights illuminate the road ahead, watched the driver navigate the turn, probably thinking about breakfast or sleep, or getting back to base in one piece. Watched the truck maintain speed, maybe 25, 30 miles per hour, as it committed to the curve. The front axle hit the cable. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. The wire caught, held, and began to absorb energy. 5 tons of truck moving at 30 miles per hour carried enormous kinetic energy, and the cable started to stretch, the stakes groaning under sudden massive lateral force. Then physics happened. The cable didn't break. The stakes didn't pull free. Instead, all that kinetic energy had nowhere to go except up. The front axle stopped moving forward while the rear of the truck continued at full speed. The vehicle didn't just flip, it catapulted, the front end rising into the air with violent, unexpected speed. The truck rotated 90 degrees in less than a second. From Jimmy's position, it looked like a giant invisible hand had reached down and swatted the vehicle skyward. The truck went vertical, balanced impossibly on its rear axle for one frozen moment, then continued rotating, completing a full barrel roll before slamming down onto its roof with an impact that they felt as a tremor through the ground. The sound arrived half a second later, metal screaming, glass shattering, cargo exploding outward, and, worst of all, the brief, awful sounds of the men inside. The second truck had no chance to stop. It slammed into the wreckage of the first, adding its own momentum to the chaos. This one didn't flip, it simply crumpled, the cab accordioning, as it collided with 5 tons of steel that was suddenly occupying the middle of the road. The third truck managed to brake, as tires screaming, sliding on frozen mud. The driver yanked the wheel, trying to avoid the wreckage, and succeeded only in putting his vehicle into the drainage ditch at 15 miles per hour. The truck tilted, balanced for a moment, then rolled onto its side with a grinding crash. Total time, from first impact to final crash, 8 seconds. 3 trucks, Probably 60 soldiers.
Completely neutralized? Kowalski lowered his binoculars slowly. Holy Mother of God! Jimmy was already moving, but not away. He was heading down the ridge, toward the wreckage, and Kowalski had to grab his arm to stop him. What are you doing? I need to adjust the cable. It stretched during impact. I need to reset the tension before the next convoy comes through. The next? Dalton, there are probably survivors down there, armed survivors, who are going to be very pissed off. Then we need to work fast. What happened next would become the most disputed part of the legend. Some versions claim Jimmy adjusted the wire while under fire, calmly resetting tension while bullets cracked past his head. Others say he rigged additional traps while Chinese soldiers were still crawling from the wreckage. A few swear he salvaged materials from the destroyed trucks to create even more elaborate obstacles. The truth was somehow both less dramatic and more impressive. Jimmy and Kowalski spent exactly 4 minutes at the site. They didn't engage survivors. Most were too injured or stunned to pose a threat. They didn't loot the vehicles or try to capture prisoners. Jimmy simply examined his cable work with the clinical detachment of an engineer inspecting a bridge, made mental notes about what worked and what needed adjustment, and then withdrew. The cable held, he said as they climbed back up the ridge. The stakes held. The geometry was right. It works, Sergeant. It actually works. Yeah, I noticed. Kowalski was breathing hard, adrenaline and exertion combining. Question is, what do we do with it? That question would be answered sooner than either of them expected. By the time Jimmy and Kowalski returned to Baker Company's position, the entire battalion had heard something happened on the supply route. The details were confused. Some said a Chinese convoy had been ambushed. Others claimed an accidental explosion. A few insisted it was friendly artillery fire. Lieutenant Chen grabbed both of them the moment they appeared. Report, now. Jimmy described exactly what happened, leaving nothing out. The cable placement, the physics of the impact, the results. Chen listened with an expression that cycled through disbelief, anger, and finally, something that might have been respect. You destroyed 3 trucks. Yes, sir. With wire. Yes, sir. Wire that you strung across a road. Aircraft arresting cable, sir, specifically positioned to catch the front axle at the optimal. I don't care about the specifics, Dalton. I care about results. Can you do it again? Yes, sir. If we have cable, stakes, and time, I can do it again. Better, actually. I learned some things from watching the impact. Chen turned to Kowalski. Sergeant, your assessment. Is this replicable, or did we just witness a lucky accident? Sir, I watched that truck flip end over end like a toy. That wasn't luck. That was physics. Dalton understands something about force and leverage that I sure as hell don't, but it works. If he says he can do it again, I believe him. Chen was quiet for a long moment, studying Jimmy with new eyes. The Chinese are advancing on a 3-mile front. They're using 5 main supply routes that we know of. If we could interdict even 2 or 3 of those routes, slow their advance, buy time for the main force to regroup. I'd need materials, sir, more cable, more stakes, and I'd need men who can work fast under pressure. You'll have whatever you need. Kowalski, you're in charge of logistics. Get Dalton everything he asks for. Dalton, you've got carte blanche to recruit whoever you want from Baker Company. Build me a team. Set up as many of these traps as you can before the Chinese figure out what we're doing. Sir,
They'll figure it out after the first few hits. Once they know to watch for wire, then you make it hard to watch for. Vary your approach. Change the positioning. You're the expert on this, Corporal. Improvise. Over the next 6 hours, Jimmy Dalton transformed from the weird sheep farmer everyone mocked into something else entirely. The most valuable tactical asset Baker Company possessed. He assembled a team of 8 men, choosing them not for combat experience, but for specific skills. Hernandez for his engineering knowledge, Fletcher for his strength. A kid named Morrison, who'd been a surveyor before the war and could read terrain like a book. A mechanic named Chen, who understood vehicle dynamics. Men who could think spatially, work precisely, and move fast. They called themselves, unofficially, and with more than a little irony, Dalton's Wire Dogs. The Chinese called them something else entirely, but that would come later. Between November 9th and November 12th, Dalton's team set up 17 wire traps across 5 different supply routes. Each one was unique, adapted to the specific terrain and approach vector. Some used the heavy aircraft cable. Others incorporated lighter gauge wire for anti-personnel work. A few featured multiple redundant systems, backup wires that would deploy if the primary cable was cut. The results were devastating. Chinese logistics officers found themselves dealing with an enemy they couldn't predict. Supply convoys that had been moving smoothly would suddenly encounter wreckage, blocking critical choke points. Attempts to clear the roads would trigger secondary traps. Routes that appeared safe one day would be death traps the next. But Jimmy wasn't just setting traps, he was learning. After the 5th successful ambush, he noticed that Chinese forces were starting to adapt. They'd send scouts ahead of convoys. They'd vary their speed. They'd use different routes. So Jimmy adapted too. He started positioning his traps in pairs. One obvious, meant to be found and cleared, and one hidden, positioned to catch the engineers who came to clear the first trap. He varied the wire height randomly, making it impossible to predict the safe approach speed. He incorporated camouflage, burying stakes, using natural terrain features to hide his work. "You're thinking like them now," Kowalski observed, watching Jimmy plan his 7th trap. "Anticipating their adaptation. It's what you do with coyotes," Jimmy replied. "They learn. You have to learn faster." The legend was growing. Soldiers who'd mocked Jimmy 3 weeks earlier were now requesting assignment to his team. Officers who'd dismissed his techniques were now studying his methods. And somewhere in the Chinese command structure, someone was trying very hard to figure out who or what was destroying their supply lines. The answer came on November 11th, when a Chinese patrol captured one of Dalton's wire traps intact. They studied it carefully, took photographs, sent reports up the chain of command. Within hours, warnings went out to all Chinese units operating in the sector. Watch for wires across roadways. Check all approach routes carefully. Consider all choke points compromised. But knowing about the threat and countering it were 2 different things. Because Jimmy had anticipated this too. November 11th, 11:30 p.m. Baker Company had pulled back to a defensive position along a ridgeline overlooking the Chongchan River Valley. Intelligence suggested Chinese forces were massing for a major push, possibly division strength, moving south with the intention of cutting UN supply lines and encircling American positions. Lieutenant Chen called a briefing at midnight. "They're coming in strength, more than we can stop with conventional defense. We've been ordered to delay them
for at least 12 hours while the main force evacuates. After that, we pull back ourselves. 12 hours? That was Staff Sergeant Mills, and his voice carried the weight of a man who knew what those orders meant. Sir, with respect, we can't hold this position for 12 hours against a division. We'll be overrun in 2. I know. That's why we're not going to hold. We're going to make them fight for every mile. Dalton. Jimmy stood up. You've been setting traps on supply routes. Can you do the same thing on an active battlefield?
Against an advancing force that knows you're out there. Every eye in the room turned to Jimmy. This was different from ambushing unsuspecting supply trucks. This was preparing to face an enemy that was alert, aggressive, and coming in overwhelming numbers. Yes, sir, but I'll need to change the approach. They'll be watching for wires now, looking for stakes. I'll need to work at night, use terrain features they can't easily inspect, and position my traps to account for the fact that they're expecting them. Can you do that? Jimmy thought about the valley below, thought about the approach routes, the terrain, the way an advancing army would move, thought about every trap he'd ever set for coyotes that had learned to avoid obvious snares. Yes, sir, but I'll need all night to set it up.
And I'll need the company to provide covering positions. If they spot us working, they'll know exactly where the traps are. You'll have whatever you need. How many traps can you set? In one night? Working with 8 men? Maybe 5. 6 if we push it. Make it 6. And Dalton? This isn't about supply trucks anymore. This is about buying time for 3,000 men to evacuate. No pressure. Jimmy almost smiled. No pressure. Yes, sir. At 1:00 a.m., Dalton's team moved out into the valley with enough cable, wire, and stakes to set up 6 major traps. They had, until dawn, approximately 5 hours, to create a defensive network that would slow a division-strength force. It should have been impossible. It would have been impossible for anyone who thought conventionally.
But Jimmy Dalton had spent his entire life thinking about how to control movement across terrain. And now he had the perfect laboratory. A frozen valley with 3 main approach routes, multiple choke points, and an enemy that would have to advance quickly to maintain momentum. The first trap went at the most obvious choke point, a narrow section of road between 2 ridgelines. Heavy cable, chest height, designed to catch the lead elements and cause maximum confusion. This was the decoy meant to be found. The second trap went half a mile behind the first, positioned where Chinese forces would naturally spread out after clearing the obvious obstacle. Anti-personnel wire at ankle height, invisible in darkness, covering 100-yard frontage, not meant to kill, but to slow and disrupt. The third and fourth traps were the clever ones. Jimmy positioned them on the flanking routes, the paths Chinese commanders would use to bypass the obvious obstacles. These used a technique he'd developed specifically for this moment, suspended cable that would release under specific tension, creating a sweeping barrier that would catch anyone trying to move fast through rough terrain. The fifth trap was pure psychology. He set it up at a point where Chinese forces would expect to be safe, well behind their own front lines, in an area that looked completely secure. Light tripwires connected to nothing, no explosives, no barriers, just wire that would snap when touched. The goal wasn't to cause casualties, but to create paranoia, to make the Chinese check every step to slow their advance through fear rather than force. But the sixth trap. The sixth trap was personal. At 2:17 a.m., exactly as detailed in the opening of this story, Corporal James Dalton lay in a drainage ditch along the Chongchan River Valley, watching 47 Chinese soldiers maneuver 3 Type 94 trucks through frozen mud 380 yards away. He had 23 feet of braided steel cable, 2 wooden stakes, and a combat knife, and he had a plan that was either brilliant or suicidal. The Chinese convoy was moving along what they believed was a secure route, a secondary road that bypassed the obvious choke points where they expected American forces to concentrate their defense. The trucks were loaded with ammunition and supplies, critical for the upcoming offensive. Speed was essential. Caution had been sacrificed for momentum. They had no idea Jimmy was there. He'd left his team hours ago, telling them he needed to do solo reconnaissance. That was partially true. But the real reason was simpler. What he was about to attempt was so dangerous, so precise in its requirements, that he couldn't risk anyone else's life on it. The convoy was 200 yards away now. Jimmy could hear the diesel engines, see the headlights cutting through morning mist. He had maybe 2 minutes before they reached his position. His hands moved with absolute certainty, muscle memory built from 1,000 fence repairs on a Nevada sheep ranch. The stakes went into frozen ground, positioned with geometric precision on either side of the narrow road. The cable stretched between them at exactly 2 feet, 3 inches, low enough to be invisible in the darkness, high enough to catch the frontal of a moving truck. 90 seconds. The cable hummed as he brought it to full tension. The stakes groaned, but held. Physics and geometry aligned in perfect synchronization. 60 seconds. Jimmy pressed himself flat in the drainage ditch, 30 feet from the road, rifle ready. If this worked, the lead truck would flip and block the road. The following trucks would crash into the wreckage. Chinese forces would be delayed at least an hour while they cleared the obstacles. If it didn't work, if he'd miscalculated the height or the tension or the approach angle, the trucks would snap his cable and he'd be exposed, alone, facing 47 enemy soldiers with nowhere to run. 30 seconds. The lead truck entered the kill zone. Everything Jimmy had learned, every hour spent adjusting fence wire, every calculation about force and tension, every observation of how predators moved through space came down to this moment. The truck's front ankle hit the cable at 28 miles per hour. The cable held. The stakes held. And physics did what physics always does when massive kinetic energy meets an immovable object. It found somewhere else to go. The truck didn't just flip, it launched. The front end rose with violent, impossible speed, the entire 5-ton vehicle rotating around its front axle like a massive catapult. Jimmy watched from the ditch as the truck went vertical, balanced for one frozen moment on its rear wheels, then continued rotating, completing a full barrel roll. It landed on its roof with an impact that Jimmy felt through the ground. Metal screamed. Glass shattered. Cargo, ammunition crates, fuel cans, equipment exploded outward like shrapnel. The second truck had no time to react. It slammed into the wreckage at full speed, adding its momentum to the chaos. The cab crumpled. The cargo bed jackknifed. Men were thrown from the impact, their bodies tumbling across frozen mud. The third truck's driver had maybe 2 seconds of warning. He hit the brakes, tires screaming, but momentum carried the vehicle forward into the pile of twisted metal that now completely blocked the road. 3 seconds. 3 trucks. Complete devastation. Chinese soldiers poured from the wrecks, some injured, all disoriented. Officers were shouting orders, trying to organize a response, but they had no idea what had just happened. No visible enemy, no explosions, just their convoy, suddenly transformed into a smoking ruin. Jimmy stayed motionless in the ditch, counting. 37 soldiers still combat effective. 10 wounded badly enough to need immediate assistance. The remaining men probably dead or dying inside the crushed cabs. The Chinese didn't panic, credit to their training, but they were confused. They fanned out, searching for the ambush they expected, weapons ready. But there was no ambush, just wire, just physics, just one corporal from Nevada who understood force and leverage better than any engineer. Jimmy waited 5 minutes. Let them spread out. Let them focus on securing the perimeter. Then he did something that would cement his legend forever. He stood up and started walking toward them. "Dalton, what the hell are you doing?" Kowalski's voice crackled in his ear. They'd rigged a basic radio system that morning. "Making sure they don't clear the road," Jimmy replied calmly. He fired 3 shots in the air, not at the Chinese, just into the sky. The effect was immediate. Soldiers who'd been focused on the wreckage spun toward the sound, weapons raised. They saw a single American soldier, standing in the open, rifle in hand. They opened fire. Jimmy was already moving, sprinting along the drainage ditch, using terrain features he'd memorized hours ago. Bullets cracked past him, kicking up frozen mud, but he'd positioned himself perfectly. The ditch provided cover. The terrain channeled their fire away from his actual path. He ran 70 yards, then triggered his second trap. The suspended cable he'd rigged released under tension, sweeping across the approach route like a scythe. 3 Chinese soldiers who'd been flanking his position caught the wire at chest height. They went down hard, not killed, but definitely out of the fight. "Jesus Christ, Dalton." Kowalski's voice was somewhere between awe and terror. "You're using yourself as bait." "That's the idea, Sergeant. Keep them focused on me. They won't clear the road. Buys us another hour." He fired twice more, carefully aimed shots that forced the Chinese to take cover. Not trying to kill, trying to distract. Trying to make them commit resources to dealing with one soldier instead of clearing the obstacle. It worked. For the next 40 minutes, Jimmy conducted a one-man guerrilla campaign that would be talked about for decades. He'd appear at one position, fire a few shots, then disappear before return fire arrived. He triggered traps he'd pre-positioned, creating the impression of multiple ambush points. He used every terrain feature, every drainage ditch, every bit of cover to stay mobile and unpredictable. The Chinese couldn't understand it. They'd massed to deal with a major defensive position, and instead found themselves fighting a ghost who hit and vanished, who seemed to anticipate their every move, who turned the terrain itself into a weapon. At 3:45 a.m., Jimmy finally withdrew, linking up with Kowalski at a predetermined rally point 1/2 mile from the wreckage. "You," Kowalski said, breathing hard, "are the craziest son of a bitch I've ever met."
Did it work? The Chinese are still trying to clear that road. You delayed a division-strength force for over an hour, single-handedly, using wire and pure balls. Jimmy allowed himself a small smile. Not just wire, Sergeant. Wire positioned correctly. But the night wasn't over. At 4:30 a.m., as gray light began seeping across the valley, Chinese forces launched their main assault.
They came in waves, infantry supported by mortars, moving with the disciplined coordination of a professional army that had fought its way across an entire continent. Baker Company's defensive line erupted in fire. Jimmy returned to his position on the ridge, rifle ready. But he wasn't thinking about shooting. He was thinking about the traps he'd set, about timing, about the way the Chinese assault would flow across terrain he'd spent all night studying. The first wave hit Trap 1 at 4:47 a.m. The heavy cable he'd strung across the obvious approach route caught a section of infantry at chest height. Men went down in a tangle of wire and bodies. The assault stalled as following elements tried to navigate the obstacle. Trap 2 triggered at 5:03 a.m. Chinese forces bypassing the obvious obstacle. Moved onto the flanking route where Jimmy had positioned ankle-height wire across 100-yard frontage. The front rank went down. The following ranks, moving in darkness, tripped over the fallen. The assault lost cohesion. But the Chinese adapted. They sent engineers forward to cut the wires. They shifted their approach routes. They started using fire support to suppress American positions. It wasn't enough, because Jimmy had anticipated this too. At 5:20 a.m., Chinese forces moved onto what they believed was a secure approach route, the path where Jimmy had positioned his psychological trap. The tripwires connected to nothing. The first soldier caught one. It snapped. Nothing exploded. No bullets fired. But the soldier stopped, called for engineers. The advance halted while they carefully checked for mines, for explosives,
For whatever trap the Americans had set. There was no trap, just wire, just paranoia, just time bleeding away, while the Chinese checked every step. "It's working," Lieutenant Chen said, watching through binoculars. "Dalton, it's actually working. They're moving like they're crossing a minefield, and there's nothing there." "There's something there, sir," Jimmy replied. "Fear. It's not as reliable as steel cable, but it's just as effective." The battle raged through dawn and into full morning. Chinese forces kept coming, kept adapting, kept pushing. But every trap they cleared cost time. Every approach route they tested cost momentum. Every casualty from wire obstacles cost morale. By 8:30 a.m., Baker Company had held for 7.5 hours. The Chinese had advanced less than 2 miles instead of the 6 they'd planned. UN evacuation columns were safely away. The delaying action had succeeded. "All units, prepare to fall back," Chen ordered. "Dalton, collapse your traps. We're pulling out." "Sir, with respect, we should leave them in place. Make the Chinese clear every one." "Dalton, sir, every minute they spend clearing wires is a minute they're not chasing our evacuation column. Leave the traps. Leave them guessing. Make them work for every yard." Chen studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Do it, but I want you and your team out first. You've done enough." Baker Company withdrew at 9:15 a.m., conducting a fighting retreat that lasted 6 hours. Chinese forces pursued, but cautiously, checking every approach route for more of Dalton's traps. The paranoia he'd created was more effective than any minefield. They reached friendly lines at 3:30 p.m., exhausted, low on ammunition, but intact. Out of a company that had started with 147 men, they'd suffered 12 dead and 31 wounded. Against a division-strength assault, they'd bought 12 hours for the evacuation. It should have been impossible. It would have been impossible without Jimmy Dalton. The legend spread fast. Within days, every unit along the UN line had heard about the corporal who stopped trucks with wire, who delayed a division with traps, who fought a one-man guerrilla campaign that military analysts were still trying to understand. The Chinese had their own version. They called him Wire Ghost and warned their drivers to watch for the invisible barriers that could appear anywhere. Some units refused to move at night.
Others demanded engineers check every approach route, even in secure areas. The psychological impact was enormous. Military intelligence got interested. They interviewed Jimmy, studied his techniques, tried to codify his methods into doctrine. They failed, because what Jimmy did wasn't really about the wire. It was about understanding terrain, enemy psychology, and physics at a level that couldn't be taught from a manual. It's spatial thinking, Mrs. Walsh would have said if she'd known. He sees the battlefield in volumes, not lines. Staff Sergeant Mills, who'd mocked Jimmy's wire techniques 3 weeks earlier, approached him one evening in December, after the Chinese offensive had been stopped and the front had stabilized. "Dalton, I owe you an apology." "No need, Sergeant." "Yes, there is. I called it your methods hillbilly rat trap bullshit. I was wrong. You saved lives with that hillbilly rat trap bullshit. Probably saved the whole battalion. Just wire, Sergeant. Positioned correctly." Mills shook his head. "No, it wasn't just wire. It was understanding something the rest of us didn't. I've been in this army 15 years, and I've never seen anything like what you did that night." He wasn't alone in that assessment. In January 1951, Corporal James Dalton was awarded the Silver Star for his actions on November 11th. The citation read, in part, "Demonstrating extraordinary tactical innovation and personal courage, Corporal Dalton single-handedly delayed enemy advance elements through the employment of unconventional defensive systems, buying critical time for friendly force evacuation. His actions resulted in the destruction or disabling of multiple enemy vehicles and the disruption of a division-strength assault." What the citation didn't mention, the technique he'd used was technically prohibited by multiple military regulations concerning improvised obstacles on active battlefields. What it also didn't mention, those regulations were quietly revised after his actions, adding sections on field-expedient vehicle denial systems. He was promoted to sergeant, offered a position training other soldiers in his techniques, asked to write a manual on improvised defensive systems. He declined all of it. "I'm a sheep farmer from Nevada," he told Lieutenant Chen. "Soon as my enlistment's up, I'm going home. Back to my father's ranch. Back to keeping coyotes away from the flock." You could do more, Dalton. The Army needs men who think like you. The Army's got plenty of men who think, sir. What it needs is men who'll do their jobs and go home. That's me. He served out his enlistment, rotating home in August 1951. He never talked about his war service, never attended reunions, never responded to requests for interviews about his techniques. To people in Elko, Nevada, he was just Jimmy Dalton, the quiet rancher who took over his father's sheep operation and ran it with unusual efficiency. But the legend persisted. military historians studied the Battle of the Changchun River Valley, trying to understand how Baker Company here held against overwhelming odds. The answer was always the same: Dalton's traps, Dalton's techniques, Dalton's understanding of terrain and psychology that turned simple wire into a strategic weapon. In 1968, during the Vietnam War, a young Army engineer named Michael Torres, no relation to the Torres who'd served with Jimmy in Korea, was designing perimeter defenses for Fire Base Charlie when he came across a classified report from the Korean War. It detailed unconventional defensive systems used in 1950, with extensive technical analysis of cable positioning, tension calculations, and psychological effects of improvised obstacles. The report's author was listed as Corporal J. Dalton, Baker Company, 23rd Infantry. Torres implemented a modified version of Dalton's techniques around Fire Base Charlie. When North Vietnamese forces attacked in March 1968, they encountered wire barriers that seemed simple but proved devastatingly effective. The attack failed. The base held. Torres tried to contact Dalton, to thank him, to learn more. He discovered that James Michael Dalton had died in 1965, age 36, of a heart attack while fixing a fence line on his ranch in Nevada. He'd lived quietly, worked hard, and never mentioned that he'd once stopped a Chinese division with 23 feet of wire. But the techniques survived. They're still taught, in modified form, at Army engineering schools. The principles, using terrain, understanding enemy psychology, positioning simple obstacles for maximum effect, are embedded in modern doctrine. And sometimes, late at night in officer training courses, an instructor will mention the legend of the wire ghost, the corporal who proved that the deadliest weapons in war don't come from factories. They come from desperate men who refuse to die. In 2018, a military historian named Sarah Chen was researching Korean War defensive tactics when she discovered something interesting. Satellite imagery of the Changchun River Valley taken for terrain analysis showed anomalies in vegetation patterns, lines of stunted growth following old road networks from the 1950s. She investigated, found that the growth patterns matched the exact locations where Dalton had positioned his cable traps. The wire had been buried or grown over, but it had left permanent marks on the landscape, scars from a battle fought with geometry and steel. She traveled to Nevada, to the ranch that had been owned by Marcus Dalton and inherited by his son James. It was still operating, now run by Margaret Dalton's grandson. The sheep were still there, grazing on the same hills Jimmy had protected 70 years earlier. "Did you know your great-uncle was a war hero?" Dr. Chen asked. "We knew he served," the grandson replied. "Never talked about it. But there's something I can show you." He led her to the northern boundary of the ranch, where a fence line ran along a ridgeline overlooking a valley. It was old, original construction from the 1940s, carefully maintained, but clearly ancient. "Uncle Jimmy built this fence when he was 12 years old," the grandson explained. "Family legend says he spent 6 months getting it perfect, testing the tension, adjusting the angles, positioning every stake precisely. Everyone thought he was crazy. It was just a fence, you know. But 75 years later, we've never lost a sheep to coyotes on this section. Never had to repair it. It's like he built something that understood exactly how predators think. Exactly how to channel their movement away from what he was protecting." Dr. Chen stood at the fence line, her hand on wire that Jimmy Dalton had positioned 3/4 of a century ago and understood something that military analysts had missed for decades. It wasn't about the wire. It had never been about the wire. It was about understanding space, force, and movement at a level that went beyond technique or training. It was about seeing the invisible architecture that governed how things moved through the world, whether sheep, coyotes, or 5-ton military trucks. Jimmy Dalton had possessed that understanding, had been mocked for it, dismissed as simple, laughed at by soldiers who thought modern warfare had no place for ancient techniques. Until the night he proved them wrong. Until the night 5-ton vehicles were flipped by 15 feet of wire. Dr. Chen published her findings in 2019. The article detailed Dalton's techniques, his psychological approach, his spatial genius. It was well received in military circles but largely ignored by the general public, which, somehow, seemed inappropriate, because Jimmy Dalton had never wanted recognition. He'd wanted to keep things safe. Sheep from coyotes, soldiers from overwhelming enemy forces. He'd done that with tools as old as warfare itself: wire, stakes, and an understanding of how force moves through space. The fence still stands in Nevada. The techniques still appear in Army manuals. The legend still spreads through military circles, embellished, exaggerated, but fundamentally true. And somewhere, in classified archives, there's a report from November 1950 that concludes with a single line: "Recommend all units be trained in field-expedient cable systems as developed by C. Pilkowitz Dalton. Method is unconventional, but devastatingly effective. Suggest formal incorporation into defensive doctrine. No one ever mocked him again. His weapon was ancient. His legend is eternal."